Well, thank you guys. Thanks for joining another Direct Connect with Archer. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you both, Leonard and Steve Parker, both managing partners here at Archer. You know, in our world, we've spent a lot of time talking about compliance, security, reliability, and sometimes all three at the same time. I know you all recently have been working on some projects where you're dealing with leaders really trying to balance all three. How do leaders effectively balance all three in their world, or do they?
I don't know that they do. It can be a challenge balancing all three. I think you should be looking at the commonalities. Think lowest common denominator, or maybe greatest common denominator, however you want to frame it. They're not identical. Reliability, compliance, security, they are certainly not identical. They do overlap in many areas. Obviously, there's a core set of concepts or principles you're trying to get to and achieve. But they all have their unique elements to them. So I don't know if anyone's really achieving it perfectly, but it's becoming a more common theme where people want to try to combine these areas and have a single comprehensive program rather than having a security team doing one thing and a compliance team doing another thing and hoping that they overlap.
Yeah, I would agree with Steve. I think surely the stated goal, at least at the federal regulator level, is that all three of those directly tie in and support each other, but that's not always the case. We have standards to ensure that reliability factor, cybersecurity standards, therefore delivering some measure of security. And then compliance, how you demonstrate that you've implemented these requirements. So theoretically, it's a good story to tell Congress, right? Yeah, we're enforcing these things and all of them support each other. But in practice, that's not always the case. Being compliant does not always mean you're secure, and vice versa. Being secure doesn't mean you're necessarily compliant. And there's certainly extreme cases of being compliant and being secure that negatively impact reliability. Definitely a challenge to balance the three.
Some examples in the electric utility sector on being secure but not compliant might be companies that want to leverage cloud-based solutions. But in the electric utility sector, you'll see many that will shy away from them because of compliance concerns. And I don't know if you see the exact same thing in the oil and gas space. That's managed by obviously TSA, the compliance world. What do you guys see there?
I would say we haven't seen those same concerns expressed just because the standards have not matured to the level that they're directly addressing those cloud-based concerns that the electric sector is dealing with the NERC CIP standards. I would say it's probably coming a lot quicker than it did for the electric sector. Obviously they're still struggling with virtualization topics, cloud-based topics, and rightfully so. I mean, there are compliance concerns related to turning over your infrastructure, your data, and not having complete control over that. On the other hand, there is an argument too that it potentially increases reliability because you're dealing with companies that do those types of things every day rather than your typical overworked staff that has to deal with compliance and all their day-to-day activities all at the same time.
I'll jump on and pair what Leonard said. And there are, I think there can be conflicts, right? You have to resolve those. And the concern on the compliance side is, what will the auditors do? What will they allow? What will they think? What do the standards say and do and allow? But the cloud or hosting or anything of that, virtualization, as Leonard mentioned, a lot of those really are focused on both security and reliability. Virtualization is great for reliability because you get redundancy and failover and very ease of failover, ease of restoration. Cloud, same thing, right? You can get higher reliability, you get scalability, and along with that, typically you're going to get probably, arguably, stronger security than you'd be able to build internally. The large cloud providers obviously have great resources, far more than what a mid-sized utility would have, for example.
From a compliance perspective, electric utilities have been at this for, I'll say, more than a decade compared to oil and gas. Are they better positioned than the oil and gas industry?
You probably would have to define better position, but if you're talking about just security in general, I don't know. I hesitate to make a comment on that. I would say potentially, the electric sector, obviously they've been dealing with, as you say, for more than a decade now, they've had security regulations. And so there are some things, for example, the separation between operational technology and general business networks has been around for quite some time. At least from what I've seen in oil and natural gas, that sort of thing still exists, but I don't, perhaps it hasn't gotten the level of scrutiny and attention to detail that it would get under a compliance regime. So I think there are some specific areas you can point to, but in general, I don't know. I'm just looking at my data set. I'm not sure that I have enough data points to say conclusively one way or another. That, and I'm trying to be polite, obviously.
Good point.
I would agree with that. It's tough to say at this early stage. Arguably we're dealing with a different sector that has, shall we say, larger budgets to spend. But, at least with the experience that we've had so far in the sector, I would say that just because they haven't been under a compliance regime doesn't mean that they have not been implementing good security practices. Certainly the TSA security directive was a heavy lift for everyone in the industry. And I think that's probably the biggest delta in being ready is more being ready from a compliance perspective and never having had mandatory and enforceable cybersecurity requirements previously, not really knowing what to expect, how to generate evidence for an auditor. Those seem to be recurring themes that we're seeing across the ONG sector.
Usually when you look at projects that wrap in, whether it's security, reliability, or compliance, it usually starts out with a strategy. How companies have developed those strategies. When I look at some of these companies that we've had the pleasure of working with, the ones that seem to be, I'll say, successful in their approach are those that have done thorough assessments, risk assessments specifically, risks on compliance, risks on reliability, not just taking action. What have you guys seen out there with the work that you've done on clients that have been doing really thorough assessments as to how they want to build their strategy?
I think what you're touching on, Mark, there is the difference between reactive and proactive approaches, and certainly early on in the electric sector with both security and compliance, a lot of it was reactive. Something bad happened, you go, you try to fix that problem that led to that. A new standard comes out, and you go and you have to react to that standard. But there's definitely been a movement and a desire to grow the maturity in the industry, and so. And when you talk about an assessment, typically you're looking at the use of a framework of some sort, whether it's and SIP to an extent is a framework, not really per se, but it can kind of be used that way. But we have the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is very commonly used as a structure to kind of develop a program around. You've got the broader NIST 853 controls. You've got the ESC2M2 maturity model that's out there. In oil and natural gas, there's been a lot of focus on the API standard, API 1164. That's out there, and so that gives you something to build around, and that's going to help guide the things and the areas you need to address. It's not going to cover the specifics necessarily, but at least you can use that to demonstrate that you're not just making things up, and you're not being just reactive. You're looking at something that's been well thought out by many people within the industry, many different points of view. Gives you good solid foundation to build upon.
Yeah, and I would actually go the other end of the spectrum and say, ironically, let me clarify. I agree with Mr. Parker, but on the other end, before the standard even comes out, I would say it's generally very reactionary. They're typically written in response to, threats, successful hacks of industry, whether abroad or international. And the policymakers, well, what would the existing regulations, have done to protect us? And if the answer is, not enough or nothing or, something in between, that's typically the driver, the reactionary action to use that example to say, hey, we need to increase our security in these areas.
It's interesting. I heard you guys mention it a couple of times just in passing, but when we're talking about both or all three compliance, security, and reliability, I heard a few different times the term budget get brought up as well. None of that is free to do. How do companies rationalize at times where they spend their money? Because sometimes it's at the peril of one or both two just to support the third one. And Leonard, I think you brought up as well. Some industries are a little more cash rich than others as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's, one of the side effects of being, investor owned companies is, you have a board to answer to, and you can't just spend money, wherever you want. Although I guess there are situations where you're big enough that you just say, even though I have a board, I'm going to go buy Twitter, for instance. So there are the outlets,
right?
But generally speaking, that old saying, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. Most organizations, compliance is a magic word to get funding, right? Maybe not to the degree that is needed all the time, but it's certainly, in my experience, regardless of the sector, the way to ensure that a project gets implemented is tying it in some way to some compliance requirement.
I'll second that. Compliance is the path to money. The other aspect is actual business impact. So you look at like in the oil and natural gas space, Colonial Pipeline happened, and regardless of whether TSA had come out with security directives or not, that the boards are looking at that, the management are looking at that and saying, how can we not be the next Colonial Pipeline? And they'll allocate some money towards that. They'll come up with they'll do risk analysis of some sort, whether it's financial risk or reputational risk or operational risk, and they'll pencil it out and they'll allocate some money towards that. But you're right. There's no, even in the wealthier industries, there's no such thing as infinite money, and anything that you do, it's got to show a cost benefit one way or another. So it can be challenging.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you do get what you measure at times, and even in our worlds, in our industries, we're starting to see more and more clients ask questions on security because they're trying to get cybersecurity insurance, and those insurance companies are now asking level 2, level 3 type questions, where in the past they were not necessarily diving as deep into these companies as well. So another side effect or impact of today's world. I guess maybe to round things out here a little bit, if you had to give an organization, a recommendation on how to go about balancing all three, compliance, security, and reliability, what recommendation would you guys give? And whoever wants to start, maybe I'll pick on Leonard first.
As someone who used to work for an electrical utility, reliability, has to come first. in ensuring the reliability of the bulk electric system is the stated goal of the SIP standards. And, while those compliance rules are in place theoretically to ensure that reliability, if you're in a situation where implementing something is going to negatively impact, operations, I think you have to think long and hard on whether that the juice is worth the squeeze there. And in my experience, explaining to a regulator, hey, this could have a negative impact on reliability if we implemented it in this fashion. Typically, you're going to get some understanding from your regulator. Whether that ends up being a dismissal of any potential findings outright, or simply $0 penalties. There are several situations that may ensue, but balancing the three, I think, is important. But reliability has to come first.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, you look for those commonalities. You look for areas where you can conduct an activity that is going to make you more secure, more reliable, and meet a compliance objective. And there's going to be a lot of those sorts of things. Beyond that, if you're not hitting all three, then I think you have to score things out. And you have to say, for each of those three areas, does it help or does it hurt? And then weigh the pros and cons of those. If it's something that's going to hurt security or hurt reliability, but it's required for compliance, you have a conversation with your regulator. If it's required for compliance, but it doesn't help security or reliability, you're probably going to do it anyways, right? So there's a variety, do the math, there's permutations on that, variety of different scenarios. But you just got to look through and assess those and look for ways that you can meet the intent, right? Because there's commonality. There will be some cases where they can contradict each other. One thing that pops up, I remember back in the day, for security reasons, we wanted to do screensaver timeouts. Somebody walks away from their computer, you want the screen to lock. It doesn't work in a control center. People step away to use the restroom, they come back, they need to have access to that computer. So there are compensating controls that can be done, but it can become a compliance issue. So think through those scenarios and just work through them. I mean, it's a process.
Yeah, and then if I can ping off of that, Steve, I mean, another example is, I think it was pre-version 5, but, encrypting data links between ESPs. And, there were some scenarios where 61850 protection relaying traffic technically qualified as routable traffic that was traversing that link, but adding encryption was introduce enough latency into the connection to break the protocol, essentially not allowing relays to talk to each other. So yeah, that's another situation where being compliant negatively impacted reliability.
I think we probably have a topic for another DirectConnect, because I'm thinking of other examples as well. I don't want to get into just due to time, but I think we could go on and come up with others where something that's required for compliance directly conflicts with security or reliability, or something that you want to do for security conflicts with compliance and or reliability, or vice versa. So maybe we'll come back and visit that another day.
I've got it noted for our next DirectConnect maybe. So thank you guys for another great DirectConnect here at Archer. I appreciate your time, Steve, Leonard. Thank you. Hope you guys have a great rest of the day. Take care.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay up to date on all the videos we release here at Archer by clicking on the subscribe button. Click on the bell to be notified right away when we release new videos. If you know of a topic or someone you think we should talk to on DirectConnect, please let us know in the comments below.